Welcome to the Resilience Series. I'm Stephanie Weaver, the author of the Migraine Relief Plan and the upcoming Migraine Relief Plan Cookbook. And for that project, I'm interviewing a variety of people on the topic of resilience. My guest today is Jeannine Ouellette. Jeannine is the principal writer and editor for the brand new Project for Advancing Healthcare Stewardship at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health. Jeannine's background is in narrative journalism and creative writing, and she's the author or co-author of several books, including The Good Caregiver with the late Dr. Robert Kane. She has just released her beautiful memoir, The Part That Burns. Welcome, Jeannine.
Hi, Stephanie. Thanks for having me.
Tell us more about the Project for Advancing Healthcare Stewardship. What are the goals and what role do you play in it?
Well, as you mentioned in your intro, it's brand new. So it's very much in a state of becoming. But ultimately, I work at the School of Public Health in the Evidence-Based Practice Center primarily. So we're interested in evidence-based practice in medicine. So we conduct systematic and comparative effectiveness reviews. And my director at the EPC, that's what we call it, is very interested in the concept of health stewardship. And my role at the School of Public Health is so unusual. Coming in, I have an MFA in a sea of MDs and PhDs and MPHs, and I'm such an odd duck in that environment that the idea of doing something across disciplines was incredibly appealing. And so the project is doing small focus group forums, we're calling them, that give people an opportunity to explore this concept through the lens of narrative. So what does it mean to be a steward of your own health and healthcare more broadly, and to do that exploration through narrative?
That's great. So, just for those of you watching, and Jeannine doesn't necessarily know this either. So, my undergraduate degree is in design and film, and then I got a master's of public health in health education. And so, I was an odd duck for those 2 years that I was in grad school. Everybody else was either an MD or a nurse. And so, it was hard for me to figure out how all that stuff fit together, and it's taken me a long time, but I think now it makes sense that I have this interest in communication and also health and also information and sharing information in a way that's really usable for people.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me what narrative medicine is, because it's a concept that is somewhat new to me. I've heard of it, but I don't know a ton about it, and it may be very new to people listening or watching. And how new is it, and kind of tell us about it?
It's about 20 years old, and the founder is a woman named Rita Sharon, who's at Columbia University. And she's interested in, so she's coming at it specifically from the perspective of the healthcare provider and bringing in the sort of the role of narrative. So what does it mean to really listen to a patient? What does a healthcare provider bring to the process of integrating a patient's story? And what's so amazing about the work that she does is the emphasis on literature itself. And so what does it mean to be able to do close readings of novels or memoirs? And how does that skill, that, and so as a writer, you know what I'm talking about, but that really close reading of understanding, why does this story work the way it does? What's happening on the page and why is it happening? That if you can bring that same skill set to listening to another human being, in the case of a healthcare setting, a provider listening to a patient, that's going to be a really different level of listening. And so, for example, one of the things that Rita Sharon would say is that the story on the surface isn't always the whole story. And sometimes it's not even, the real story. So to really understand, plot and motive and unreliability and all of the kinds of things that we talk about in writing, if you bring that kind of discernment, that deep interest and deep listening to medicine, how transformative would that be?
That's amazing. I took a class in, I think it was, I can't remember if it was called narrative healing, but it was like storytelling and healing. And it was really powerful to hear what people wrote and what we read. And it kind of, you tapped into things that you didn't even really know were going on with yourself or potentially your health. So I think it's super powerful, and it's really exciting to hear that medicine. So when you said earlier evidence based, what that means is things that used to be doctors would kind of roll their eyes at. Now people are trying to study and find the evidence that these things actually work. So an example might be mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Mhm.
People used to say, well, it's just meditation. How can it help? And now they've done all these studies and they've studied people's brains under fMRIs, and they actually see that, oh, the brain actually changes when you meditate and it might have these effects. So that's what's really cool, is kind of understanding how these things start to fit together. Tell us about how your work deals with health disparities and anti-racism.
Well, I'm glad you're asking about that. No sooner were we just getting on our feet with that than George Floyd was murdered. And all of we had, our city was on fire, the university was, shut down, everyone's remote, the pandemic is ramping up. And here is our little tiny project on advancing healthcare stewardship. So we kind of took a breath and said, okay, we need to establish a steering committee to help us really, really incorporate, like integrate, make far forward these priorities of disparities and inequities. And so one of the ways that's looked for us so far is in our recruitment. So our forums will start next month, and we're working with a number of organizations locally to make sure that we are starting our conversations with groups of people that are the most in need.
What I saw happen last year was the recognition that it's not enough to not be a racist. You have to actively work to be anti-racist. And white people, kind of coming to recognize that that work was being done by Black and brown people and had been being done for a very long time. But those of us who were distressed by George Floyd's murder and were protesting and were saying this cannot keep happening, we need to do something, said, all right, well, okay, so I read a bunch of books, or maybe they hadn't read books, and so then people were saying, well, what books do I read? And so it was this whole like education process that, yes, feels very late if you're a Black or brown person. Like, all right, we get, like, thank you for joining us. Well, we're glad you're finally here. Like, we've been waiting for you for a very, very long time. And so the other piece of it that I saw was a lot of people last year were using books to try to wrap their brains around all of this. And so there were a lot of people reading the same books. Like, a lot of books went on to the bestseller list that had already been out for a few years. And then there was discussion about which books of those are the best to read, and why. And there were people arguing about that. And what's, I think, happening this year is that I'm seeing more fiction coming out from Black and brown authors, that people are now saying, okay, well, I read the nonfiction. Now I want to start supporting these artists. And I just interviewed someone for my other show, The Blue and Yellow Kitchen, Nancy Johnson, whose book, The Kindest Lie, is set in Chicago and a small town in Indiana, right after Obama is elected. So for white people, that was the post-racial proof that we were in this post-racial period. And for Black people, it was like, yeah, no. Yes, it's great that he's president, but we don't really expect a whole lot to change. And it deals with the issues of racism and classism and family and secrets. And I think there's something really powerful about storytelling taking you into those feelings and experiences that's different than nonfiction. So it's just kind of a plug for the idea of healing around narrative and story. Can look a lot of different ways, and some of those ways are fiction, and some of those ways are memoir. And your memoir, I think we'll talk about in a moment, but is an example of, I think probably your healing journey. But before I get to that, we're talking about anti-racism. So tell us about your work in prisons and how that maybe fosters resilience.
Well, so I teach through the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop. So you're talking about the role of narrative in personal healing. And this is where I think things get really interesting, because we know there's so much research, and you might be familiar with James Pennebaker at University of Austin.
Well,
University of
tell us
Chicago.
about him because even if I was, maybe the viewers wouldn't be. So, yeah.
Yeah, so he has done a lot of work around what he calls expressive writing to heal. And what I think is really interesting about his work, and I use some of his techniques when I teach writing in any setting, is that his emphasis is on an expressive writing technique that it's he's very clear in distinguishing it from journaling because it's done over a finite period of time. He usually recommends 4 days for 15 or 20 minutes a day. And the emphasis really is on creating story. So his feeling, he's done a lot of research on what happens after people complete this exercise. And one of the theories that he stands by is that it's actually through the process of shaping the narrative. So that means you're going in and you're actually seeing different perspectives, and you might be discovering new insights about the story. It's a very different process internally and externally than just repeating the same story that you already think you know, and the version of it that you've been telling maybe your whole life. Incarceration is an extremely stressful, it's an ongoing trauma. It's living in a state of trauma to be incarcerated. And so to have an opportunity to work with narrative in that way, it doesn't matter whether it's fiction, poetry, nonfiction, memoir. I just finished teaching a flash class. The idea is to be able to make art out of narrative in a situation where that's so necessary. It's really hard to overstate the value of that. And in terms of resilience, I think your question was around resilience. We're really talking about integration. You know, we're language based human beings. We're extremely language based, and so that's our tool. And we have our bodies have a knowing, and then we have the way that we talk about ourselves or our lives, and our thought processes are in words. So when you can make those words a tool of your own self-understanding, integration of experience, it's just incredibly powerful. When you're doing that in a setting where people are really deprived of opportunities, to explore and learn and integrate, it's just it's a big privilege to do that work.
Thank you for sharing. So, your memoir, The Part That Burns, absolutely blew me away. It's like nothing else I've ever read. And I've read a lot of memoir. I think I've read 60 on my list that I'm aware of. So, was it a healing experience for you to write it?
It definitely was, just without question. It was also really hard. It was really hard to write it, and it took a really long time. And the for me, the breakthrough, for finally being able to write this material, I just never wrote about my childhood. The memoir deals with some hard themes, and there's some abuse and childhood sexual abuse in the memoir, and I couldn't write about that in a way that accomplished what we're talking about here today, which is to shape a narrative that is really a story, that's really something more than the sum of its parts, that's more than just this happened, um, that could achieve that, whatever that alchemical process is that takes experience and elevates it into art. That was really hard to do with this material. And then I discovered some tools that, primarily in the form of a literary technique called writing constraints. And so I did a lot of experimentation, and the memoir is it's pretty experimental in its form. So it really took that for me, to get that material to a place where I felt like it was actually something that maybe could offer something to someone else that was, more than just, a record.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of sort of well known trauma memoirs. The Glass House, which was made into a film. I would say Wild was kind of in
Mm.
some ways, a trauma memoir about the traumatic loss of her mother at a young age. And certainly that, straight narrative can be extremely powerful. And what I found so fascinating, I mean, it feels like it's really hard to invent something new. And so whenever I read something that really feels like nothing else that I've read, I just kind of tip the hat to that author, because that's just not easy to do. And so, so I'll just give like sort of my take on the book was that you each, I guess I would call them chapters, each section, or, they're sort of framed in separate pieces, and you explore kind of the same material, but in different ways. So you're talking about it, and sometimes you're a very young child, or sometimes it's, um, I, I can't remember specifics at the moment, but it's like as if like one time you say, I'm going to talk about and think about this through the use of color. That would be a constraint, or and maybe you can talk about what some of the constraints were and help me out here. But so you were kind of repeating, so it was sort of cyclical. Like, oh, okay, we're doing this again. Okay, this isn't chronological. And as soon as I recognized, I think in the first or second section, I said, oh, okay, I have to just let that expectation go that this is a chronology. And I actually found that I had taken a course on Native American literature years ago, and that storytelling is circular. And so that was very difficult for me as a Western European educated reader to do initially, until I said, I have to just surrender to the material. I have to just surrender to this book and let this book, and I might not get any of the names or know who the people are. I just have to surrender to the storytelling. And then it was a really incredible process. And I felt the same way with your book. I had to just sort of surrender to what you were doing, feel that it was worth the ride, and just go along. And so is there one about ice or roads or something? I feel like there's something about ice and roads that came up a bunch of times. Tell us what some of the constraints were. That will help, because I know I'm kind of mangling this terribly.
No, it's really interesting to hear you talk about it. And there are circular stories, and I don't know if they're chapters either.
Yeah.
There's vignettes. I don't really know what they are.
Oh, vignettes. Okay, I like that. I think that because they are very word picture-y.
Yeah.
So okay, we'll call them vignettes and not chapters. Okay.
They're vignettes. But there are at least two or three that make that circle, that start in one place and then you end in the same place. But the book as a whole, actually another writer, or it was a reviewer, I think, gave me the word for the structure. I hadn't really called it this or understood it as this, but she called it elliptical. And I thought, oh, right, that is what it's doing, because you swing forward and then you swing back and then you swing forward and then you swing back. And as the book moves forward, we are gradually moving forward in time.
Yes. You do eventually get older.
We do eventually get older, but we
Yeah.
don't ever get any older than we are at the end of the first vignette, really. So anyway, but the constraints, so that's just a whole other thing, like the use of time, the use of time is different. And I think that the idea for me with that is that's it's not unlike how trauma works, in the body and in the course of a lifetime. We don't have an experience and then that experience is over and now we go forward and that's the end of that. That's not how it works. And I love Einstein's, statement, it's all now. There is no past, there is no future. It's all now. And it's just our own. We're not there yet. We can't because we don't have the capacity to really experience time that way. We can't really get our mind around that. But if you think about how we live and where we are in our minds most of the time, that's why mindfulness is so difficult. It's actually very difficult for us to be in just one moment at a time. It's not how we live and it's not how we experience our lives. So I think the book sort of attempts to mimic that. The first vignette, which is the longest one, it's called 4 Dogs, Maybe 5. And the constraint with that was the dogs. So I had to move through time using these dogs as a reference point. And when I
So put your writing teacher hat on and imagine that for just a moment, you're teaching a class and everybody who's watching is in your class and they have some difficult thing that they'd like to heal from. What would be one writing prompt you would give them to do an exercise like this?
is, I call it replace the words. It's really simple, but I'll have a passage. I like to use Jane Hamilton's opening paragraph of The Map of the World, her novel, because the sentences are really cascading and sort of breathless. It's wonderful writing. And so you take a passage, and it doesn't have to be that one, and then you replace every word of the sentence with your own words. And I like to give people levels of difficulty. So it's more difficult if you have to do match the parts of speech. So noun for noun, verb for verb, etc. And the punctuation, everything, being exactly the same, except that the words are your own. And it's very tricky. It's like doing a puzzle. So you're running through a noun, and it's very engaging to the system 2 of your brain. I'm a big armchair student of like cognitive science and theory. And there's a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, which explains the 2 systems of the brain. And the way that he very simply lays it out is that system 1, we're in it all the time. It's the system where, I'll just do a quick little experiment. How many of each animal did Moses bring on the ark with him?
2.
No, because Moses didn't bring any
animal. Oh, right.
So that's an example of system 1. System 1 knows the answer to the question before the question is even finished. And so system 2, and we're in it all the time, and that's why we're always leaping to wrong conclusions and kind of stuck in our own, we're always making a story, right? And we're making that story really quickly, but we need it to get by. We couldn't possibly go through a slow decision-making process for like moving our left foot. So system 1, that's system 1. System 2, we use for calculus, we use for really difficult tasks. And the way Kahneman explains it, our cheeks will flush, our heart rate actually increases, we sweat. We don't like to use system 2, we'll avoid it at all costs, which is why there'll always be a contingent of people in the group that will be really frustrated with this exercise because it really does, challenge system 2. But when system 2 is activated, when system 2 is engaged, system 1 is effectively disabled. And so what can happen then is that system 1 that is prone to repeating, system 1 just likes to say what it said last time, maybe in different words, but it's the same thing. And system 1 can't do that. If somebody really goes deeply into the exercise, and just like you said, you have to surrender to it. If you surrender and really go deep into what it's asking you to do, then system 1 is quieted, and something that you haven't said before has the opportunity to present itself on the page, and you step back and say, wow. So that would be an example of a pretty tight constraint.
And that, so one of the things that it makes me think of is that that's when you start to get at what's underneath whatever's bothering that person. Mm-hmm. Right. So I work as a speaking coach, and one of the things I do for people initially is do kind of a sort of an interview where I talk with them, and we talk about what their topic is and what they think they're going to talk about. But I'm trying to get at what their passion is around that. And so I'll be listening, but I do these face-to-face via video like this. And I'm looking for that person to light up. So when you started talking about Jane Hamilton, your face got brighter. And, I was like, oh, I would be making a note like, oh, that's something that really made Jeannine passionate. Let's talk more about that. But what will happen is at some point, someone will give me this very sort of offhand comment that is like a throwaway comment. And I have like little radar for those. And I'll go, that's really interesting. So I had one speaker who said, and it was nothing to do with what we were talking about seemingly, but she said, well, my boyfriend says, even if a door's open, I'm going to go through the window. Well, as a coach, and it's possibly like you as a writing teacher, well, I want to know about that. Like,
Right.
I don't actually really care about whatever topic we thought we were going to. I want it because that to me is and she was a very successful entrepreneur. So I would want to know that. I want to talk about that. And so I think for what it sounded like with these exercises, if people are really struggling or they're feeling stuck or they're wanting healing around something or they want to build resilience, which is what this interview series is about, even if you're not a writer. So these are not necessarily exercises for people who want to be professional writers. It's the experience of doing it can help you tap into looking at your story differently. And okay, so you have to write out character worksheets like you would in fiction. And you're the protagonist usually of the memoir, and then you have to have an antagonist. And a lot of people balk at that because they don't want to have a parent or a sibling or a spouse be the antagonist. But stories don't work if there's not conflict, right? But it's just taking that kind of step away from yourself and saying, well, am I a likable narrator? Are people going to be rooting for me? That can change. And what you did with giving the same story and kind of taking different passes at it with these different constraints, I'm assuming allowed you to see those experiences differently and maybe release some of the pain and the trauma that those experiences still held for you. I don't want to put words in your mouth though. So is that the case?
I think that's very much the case. And I think, there's Emily Rapp is a memoirist. She wrote The Still Point of the Turning World. And actually, she just came out with a new memoir, I think, or maybe it releases in April. It's called Sanctuary. And she's a beautiful writer. But in The Still Point of the Turning World, which deals with the life and death of her son who had Tay-Sachs. So that's for listeners who may not know, a very serious and always fatal genetic condition where children die by the time they're 3. So really tragic experience for a parent. And she wrote that memoir, The Still Point of the Turning World, while going through that experience. And she has this beautiful passage where she was already a writer by this time. She was already teaching writing. And she talked about how she could see her old self kind of prattling on, telling people you need distance. You can't write about trauma from inside of trauma, et cetera, et cetera. And here she was, the only way to really to live through what she was going through was to write her way through it. But she also said something that's really key, and I always use this when I'm teaching, that it wasn't just in the writing down. That wasn't the part that saved her life. It's through the revision. It's through the wrestling with the language. It's through everything that you're talking about. It's through finding the structure. It's through, discerning and identifying these various, characteristics that make a story work. That's where the inner transformation also happens. And I think that's so important for all of us to understand. And you don't have to be a professional writer. You don't have to want to publish to benefit from a very vulnerable process, because not only do you open yourself to failure, you may try one thing and it didn't work. I tried 2 different structures for my memoir that just didn't really work. But also you have to be willing to discover versions of your story that aren't the ones that you have been telling yourself, that you will have things revealed to you that weren't quite as you thought or weren't quite as you had understood.
Great. So those of you who are watching, if you're not writers, please don't glaze over. This is still, there's still value in doing these exercises, taking different passes and the reason for doing that is to heal, right? Is to let things go, to move forward, to release things. You don't ever have to show anybody stuff you write down. It's not about, becoming a professional writer. That's not why I had Jeannine on the series. It's because I was fascinated with how unusual her book is in terms of structure and how powerful it is, and also the work that she's doing. And I felt like it was really important to have this conversation. So I just want to be really clear. I also, will be a transcript available in my group on Facebook. So you just search Migraine Relief Plan I'll let you have to answer a couple questions. I'll let you in, and then the transcript is there. So any of these books that she's mentioning, if you're curious about them, that will all be in that transcript. So so feel free to come over and do that. And my last question for Jeannine, I ask everybody the same last question. So tell me about your self-care resilience strategies. How do you take care of yourself, and how do you build your own resilience?
Tell myself about writing in this way is that it gives us a real visceral experience regularly if we do it, that things can change, and that things are this idea that there's things beyond what we know, and there's more than one answer. And I think that is resilience. Like for me, to be constantly exercising that muscle. John Keats talks about negative capability, which is an artist has to have this ability to see beyond what they know. So does a human. I really do think that that is where resilience lives, because there's nothing less resilient than feeling stuck. So I think, these practices like meditation, and this is very similar, it's just a different way in, that build that capacity. So anyway, so I just wanted to say that. And then in terms of other than what I have been finding so healing, especially during the pandemic, it's made me more aware of it, is sleeping and walking. Just really simple practices, getting enough sleep, sleeping when I need to sleep, letting myself say it's okay, I need to sleep, and walking. It's amazing how much that can shift a day or an hour.
Absolutely. Jeannine, thank you again for being here today and sharing your story and your wisdom with us. Please visit Jeannine Ouellette .com to learn more about her work. And you can find The Part That Burns wherever books are sold. Please do get her beautiful memoir. It really will have a massive impact on you, I think. Check out other episodes of the Resilience series on Facebook Watch, IGTV, and YouTube, and follow me at SWeaverMPH to learn more about my upcoming book, The Migraine Relief Plan Cookbook, which is due out in spring 2022 from Surrey Books. Thanks so much for watching.